my talk is The Freedom of the Mind and the Tyranny of the Passions, Socrates' Critique of Homer's Education in the Republic. In the most famous passage in Plato's Republic, Socrates' account of the image of the cave, Socrates virtually identifies philosophy with freedom. It is the philosophers whose minds are released from imprisonment in the cave so that they may enjoy the happiness of contemplating the world as it truly is. It is those with philosophic natures, the best natures, who are liberated from darkness and falsehood so that they may become truly educated and experienced in the truth and may live by the light of the truth. And yet the foundation of the philosophic education set forth by Socrates in the Republic, an education that culminates in the freedom of the mind, entails a severe curtailment of the freedom of the mind. For as Socrates explains, the education of philosophic natures requires the suppression of certain truths, lest they provoke passions that will overwhelm and enslave their reason. Socrates' account of the proper education of the philosophic guardians of his imaginary just city consists in large measure of a remarkably harsh critique of Homer, the poet singled out in the Republic as the educator of the Greeks. Socrates does express a certain love for Homer, as well as a certain shame before the poet that has possessed him since childhood. Nevertheless, Socrates emphatically attacks Homer for undermining the sway of reason in the souls of those shaped by his poems. This attack, moreover, seems distinctive to Plato's Socrates, since Xenophon, who also wrote Socratic dialogues and who presents his dialogues as historical, never presents Socrates criticizing Homer. Plato's Socrates attacks Homer for telling harmful lies and also harmful truths about gods and humans, attacks Achilles, the hero presented by Homer as the best of humans, as wholly unworthy of imitation, and attacks the Homeric education as a whole for empowering the passions over reason, and hence for setting up as ruling in us what ought to be ruled. That's a quote. Socrates therefore insists that Homer be expelled from the most just city imaginable, the city that is to be ruled by philosophers. If Homer is the educator of the Greeks, that education is, according to Plato, profoundly defective. Plato's Socrates does not criticize Homer for being intentionally hostile to philosophy. Indeed, Socrates presents Homer as friendly to philosophy, and even as a philosophic thinker himself. In the Republic, he speaks of Homer as a wise man comparable to such philosophers and sophists as Thales, Pythagoras, Protagoras, and Prodicus. In the Theaetetus, Socrates identifies Homer as the forerunner, the general, and apparent inspiration for such Greek philosophers and sophists as Protagoras, Heraclitus, and Empedocles, indeed for all the wise ones except the philosopher Parmenides. Socrates suggests there as well that by stating through the mouth of Hera that Oceanus was the origin of the gods, the genesis of the gods, Homer covertly set forth his own thesis that all things are offspring of flowing and motion. That is, that all things are products of natural forces, and hence that supernatural beings do not exist, and thereby founded the philosophic tradition of skepticism concerning the gods, exemplified later by Heraclitus, Empedocles, Protagoras, and others. One may wonder why, if Homer is as philosophic as Plato's Socrates intimates, Homer does not present explicitly philosophic characters in his poems, who speak of philosophy, argue for the philosophic life, and live that life. Plato offers a possible answer to this question through the mouth of his Protagoras. As his Protagoras observes, Homer was the first of a long line of cautious wise men, or sophists, of men who both possessed and taught wisdom, but who sought, quote, to make a disguise for themselves and to cover themselves with it, some in poetry, as in the case of Homer and Hesiod and Simonides, in order to avoid popular hostility. In this way, Plato suggests Homer himself lived the life of the mind and deliberately hid it. Homer's poems provide considerable evidence for the Platonic suggestion that Homer was a philosophic thinker. As Leo Strauss noted, it is in Homer's poems that the foundational philosophical term nature first appears in extant Greek literature. In the Odyssey, where the god Hermes reveals to Odysseus that there is a certain fixed order of the world, a natural order that limits the power of the gods. Moreover, Homer's first and more fundamental poem, the Iliad, indicates that Homer's education of the Greeks is one that points to the contemplative life of the mind as the best way of life. To be sure, the leading model of human excellence in Homer is Achilles. But what does it mean to imitate Achilles? Achilles is not only the most formidable warrior in Homer's poems, but is also the hero who speaks most emphatically in the assembly to save the army from disaster, the hero with the widest and the deepest friendships, the only hero in the Iliad who loves and performs music, and as he shows at the end of the Iliad, when he freely grants the Trojan king Priam and his people a 12-day truce to bury their beloved Hector in peace, the most compassionate hero in the poem. Most importantly, Achilles is the only hero in the poem who questions the life of the hero, who questions the value of honor and the goodness of virtue. He is the hero who comes closest both to accepting the finality of death and to recognizing the truth that the carefree gods neither care for humans nor understand them. And yet Achilles is also the most criticized character in the poem. The Iliad opens with a devastating criticism of Achilles, whose destructive anger led to the deaths of countless numbers of his fellow soldiers. And he is repeatedly criticized over the course of the poem by his king, by his beloved companions, by Apollo, by Homer, and by Achilles himself. Furthermore, Achilles is a character who suffers terribly in the poem, more terribly than any other character. Accordingly, Homer presents Achilles as weeping more than any other character in the poem. Homer then centers his education in human excellence on a complex hero, a great but evidently and admittedly flawed and sorrowful model of human excellence, a human being who questions the life that he leads, and hence a model who points beyond himself. To imitate Achilles is to imitate a tragic figure whose flaws and sorrows, upon reflection, lead one to consider another, less visible but superior model of human excellence, that of the contemplative and humane singer Homer himself. The happiest we ever see Achilles, the happiest we ever see any human being in the Iliad, is the moment when he is singing, quote, delighting his mind with his lyre. With it he delighted his spirit and sang of the glories of men. The fact that Homer says that Achilles delighted his mind by singing of the glories of men suggests that Achilles has found pleasure and satisfaction in reflecting on men like himself, who have apparently performed deeds that are worthy of glory and who may or may not have received the glory they deserved. Thinking about honor rather than seeking it or even possessing it has, for the moment at least, supplied Achilles with some portion of the happiness that has eluded him. In his contemplative singing, Achilles points to the example of the contemplative singer, Homer. Now, Plato's Socrates does not deny that Homer intends through his education to celebrate the contemplative life of the mind. He does not criticize Homer for being opposed to the cultivation of reason. Socrates rather criticizes Homer for being ineffective in his efforts to cultivate reason, above all because he underestimates the threat posed to reason by the passions. Homer assumes not that reason naturally rules over human beings, but that human beings have a certain natural openness to reason and a certain general capacity to develop it, especially through experiencing, as his great hero Achilles does, the tragic conflicts of political and military life and the painful questions those conflicts give rise to. But in the Republic, Socrates suggests that reason always has a precarious position in the human soul of even philosophic natures, that even such souls do not possess a nature that simply supports reason, and that the passions in particular always threaten to overwhelm and dominate reason. Therefore, for Socrates, the proper nurture of even philosophic natures is crucial in order to strengthen their reason, and that nurture must begin from early childhood. For human souls can be molded in radically different ways. As Socrates remarks, don't you know that the beginning is the greatest part of every work, especially with whatever is young and tender? For at that time, it is especially molded and takes on the impression that someone might wish to stamp on each. Philosophy, the love of wisdom, does not naturally tend to rise to lead the soul as a result of challenging, thought-provoking experiences in politics and war, as Homer suggests. Philosophy requires a soul that has been properly educated, properly prepared and molded by appropriate tales, by salutary lies, in order to predominate in the soul. Socrates' critique of Homer's education and human excellence takes the form of a ferocious attack on Achilles, the hero Homer identifies as the greatest by far, but whom Socrates criticizes each of the 5 times he names him in the Republic. Socrates explicitly attacks Achilles by name for wailing and grieving like an unserious woman, and for possessing the diseases of a liberality together with the love of money and arrogance toward gods and human beings. And when citing Achilles' words without mentioning his name, Socrates implicitly attacks him for lacking courage in the face of death and lacking moderation, inasmuch as he is disobedient toward his ruler Agamemnon. What renders these attacks on Achilles especially scathing is their singular and unremitting character. No other hero is criticized as severely or as comprehensively as is Achilles. Socrates criticizes Priam, Achilles' tutor Phoenix, Theseus, and Perithous by name, but only once each. Socrates praises Diomedes by name for his moderation, insofar as he enthusiastically obeys his ruler Agamemnon and never criticizes him. And while Socrates implicitly criticizes Odysseus for immoderately praising food and drink, he also implicitly praises him for being the wisest man and for his endurance. But Socrates never praises Achilles at all, explicitly or implicitly. He criticizes Achilles more than any other hero for lacking courage in the face of death and for lamenting the death of a loved one. And he criticizes Achilles, and Achilles alone, among all the heroes, for immoderate disobedience of his ruler, love of money, and arrogance toward gods and humans. Now, Socrates' attack on Achilles is clearly polemical, an evident attempt to dethrone Achilles as the model of human excellence for the Greeks, the model. Socrates singles out Achilles for lacking courage, even though he is far more courageous than any other Homeric hero, on the battlefield and off the battlefield. Socrates singles out Achilles for immoderate disobedience to Agamemnon, even though Diomedes, Nestor, and as Megillus points out in the Laws, Odysseus also rebuke Agamemnon, even though Agamemnon later rebukes himself, and even though Achilles saves the Achaeans from disaster by taking it upon himself to defy Agamemnon. Socrates singles out Achilles for loving money, even though he refuses the extravagant treasures Agamemnon offers to him, and even though other Achaeans, most notably Odysseus, love money more. Socrates condemns Achilles for slaughtering 12 captured prisoners and praises Odysseus for his endurance, even though Odysseus practices endurance specifically so that he may later slaughter 12 captured maidservants as well as 8 male servants, all 108 of the largely unarmed suitors of his wife, including Laodes, who rightly protests his innocence, and Odysseus hopes all of the dead suitors' relatives. Perhaps most remarkably, Socrates never praises Achilles at all, for example, for his hatred of lying, even though Socrates declares in the Republic that the citizens should not lie to their rulers. And even though, as Socrates himself notes in the Hippias Minor, Achilles, in contrast to the frequently mendacious Odysseus, denounces lying most emphatically. Now, Homer himself criticizes Achilles sharply in the course of his poem, but he also praises his hero. Socrates, however, has nothing but criticism for the best of the Achaeans. Socrates does, however, offer a serious, non-rhetorical criticism of Achilles as well, one that forms the basis of and justifies the desire to dislodge him from his position as the hero of the Greeks. In Socrates' view, Achilles is not only a flawed character, as Homer himself acknowledges, but one whose example risks harming those who model themselves on him. And even though Homer may intend that admirers of Achilles be led upon reflection to recognize the superiority of the contemplative life to the life of the dutiful warrior, Socrates suggests that Achilles is presented as such a brilliant, if flawed character, that he inevitably overshadows the hidden figure of the wise, humane singer who composed the Iliad. The broad focus of Socrates' criticism of Achilles concerns his passionate character, his fear of death, his weeping over the death of his beloved friend, his anger, of course, his alleged love of money, and his love of honor. A consideration of the passionate character of Achilles helps to clarify in a general way both Homer's understanding of the relation between the passions and reason and Socrates' critique of that understanding. For Achilles is the most passionate character in the Iliad, the angriest, for example, and the one who weeps the most. And also, he is the most thoughtful character, the one who questions most the dutiful life of the warrior and the providence of the gods, and the one who comes closest to accepting the finality of death. Moreover, in Homer's account, Achilles is thoughtful not despite his passionate character, but in some measure because of it. It is Achilles' intense anger at Agamemnon and the Achaeans that leads him to question the life of the dutiful warrior that he has led for 9 years. And it is his intense grief over the death of his beloved Patroclus that leads him to contemplate the finality of death and to call into question the providence of the gods. Through the example of Achilles, Homer seems to suggest that it is the passions that give humans the motive and also the strength to question their most cherished convictions and their deepest hopes. But Socrates suggests, especially by highlighting the degree to which Achilles remains in the grip of sorrow and anger even at the end of the Iliad, that Achilles does not pursue the questions he raises further than he does, because the very passions that inspire his questions overwhelm his reason, and therefore arrest his questioning. Socrates might concede that Achilles has moments of genuine questioning, moments in conversation with his friends in Book 9 or in conversation with Priam in Book 24, in which he appears to transcend his passions and achieve a considerable measure of clarity concerning the problem of the life of duty, the gulf between humans and gods, and the finality of death. Nevertheless, Socrates suggests that each of Achilles' moments of lucidity is overwhelmed by his unbridled passions of grief, anger, and hope. Homer's overall presentation of Achilles as a model of human excellence, then, vividly reflects Homer's dangerous underestimation of the power of the passions and of their abiding opposition to reason. Now, the specific focus of Socrates' criticism of Achilles concerns his posture toward death, his fear of death, his lamentation at the death of his beloved companion, and his refusal to accept the finality of death, as his treatment of the corpses of Patroclus and Hector as though they were alive reveals. Socrates begins his critique of Achilles as a model of human excellence by arguing first that the poets must praise death in order to inspire the guardians to be courageous. That is, to, quote, fear death least, or even to be fearless toward death. Socrates then suggests that those who embrace Achilles' view of death and Hades as bad will fear death more than slavery, and that they will be, quote, hotter and softer than they ought. Yet, as Socrates certainly knew, Achilles evidently did not fear death more than slavery, for he continued to fight bravely at Troy up through his death, and he did so even though, unlike all the other warriors, he somehow knew that his death at Troy was certain if he remained there to fight. What then is Socrates' serious criticism of Achilles with respect to courage? Homer suggests that true courage entails the recognition that death is an evil, and the willingness to face it nonetheless. The Achaeans, for example, are more courageous than the Trojans, because while the Trojans must whip themselves into a frenzy and hence suppress their reason in order to go into battle, like screaming birds and cranes and bleating sheep, says Homer, the Achaeans, quote, went in silence, breathing spirit, and hence do not simply suppress their rational awareness of the evil of death that they are facing. Now, Achilles is the most courageous of the Achaeans, again, not only because he is always at the forefront of every battle, but also because while all the other warriors know that they risk death at Troy, he alone knows with certainty that he will die at Troy should he remain and fight. Moreover, Achilles alone has the courage to stand up to the mighty Agamemnon when that king foolishly and selfishly imperils the survival of all the Achaeans by defying the priest of Apollo. To be sure, Achilles fears death and wrestles with that fear throughout, and he even wonders whether a long quiet life of peace is not superior to a short life as a dutiful warrior. Nevertheless, the fact that Achilles persists in fighting on, even though burdened with such anguish and such reasonable doubts, demonstrates in Homer's account the superior quality, the strength, and reasonableness of his courage. In the context of his critique of Homer, Socrates affirms that in reviling rather than praising death and Hades, the poets, quote, say what is neither true nor beneficial for the ones who are to be fighters. But Socrates omits here any argument whatsoever that death and Hades are in truth good and praiseworthy, but instead explains why it is harmful for poets to portray death as an evil for the spirited and philosophic guardians, that is, for men who are to be, quote, both warrior and philosopher. Quote, "If they are to be courageous, must one not tell them these things, and of a sort that will make them fear death least? Or do you believe that anyone will ever come to be courageous having this terror in him? Do you suppose that anyone who believes the things in Hades exist and are terrible will be fearless toward death, and will choose death in battles before death, defeat, and slavery? So much less must these passages from Homer be heard by boys and men, who must be free, having feared slavery more than death." Socrates evidently does not argue here that death is not truly an evil, or that the fear of death is unreasonable. He argues instead that if one believes, even reasonably, that death is an evil, one will be enslaved to one's fear of death. And such enslavement to the fear of death, Socrates suggests, is harmful in two respects. First, as Socrates stresses, it is harmful because it leads humans to sacrifice the freedom of their political community in order to stay alive at all costs. But secondly, as Socrates indicates, such enslavement to the fear of death is harmful to human reason because it precludes the freedom from the sway of the passions necessary to think clearly and soundly. Accordingly, as Socrates later affirms, one who has, quote, "a philosophic nature will believe that death is not something terrible." Now, reason would seem to suggest that death is indeed evil. For, as a wise woman, Diotima, reportedly taught Socrates, we humans, apparently all us humans, naturally long to possess the good always. And insofar as it marks the term of our existence, death necessarily thwarts that longing. On the other hand, since death is inevitable to human beings, it would seem to be unreasonable to devote one's life to fleeing it in the hope that one can fully escape it. Reason then would seem to counsel at once a recognition that death is evil and an acceptance of its inevitability. But what Socrates suggests in the Republic is that even though the fear of death may well be reasonable, inasmuch as death is evil, the fear of death is so powerful that it threatens to overwhelm both the love of freedom and reason itself, and hence threatens to undermine the courage either to risk one's life or to face and accept the inevitability and finality of one's own death. Paradoxically, the rational fear of death undermines reason. Therefore, Socrates argues, the fear of death can only be properly controlled by instilling in human beings from childhood the firm conviction that death is not evil but good, and hence that it is unreasonable to fear death. In this way, the menacing fear of death can be, as Socrates puts it in the Phaedo, charmed away by the soothing belief in the goodness of death, and the human mind can be freed to contemplate with balance and calm. Even if then it is false to believe that death is good, Socrates suggests that this falsehood is necessary for the empowerment of reason. Here again, Socrates points to a fundamental theoretical disagreement with Homer, a disagreement over the relative strength of human reason. Homer believes that humans as a whole can recognize the evil of death without being enslaved to the fear of death. But Socrates contends human reason is weak. It is vulnerable to the passions, perhaps especially to the fear of death that always threatens to overwhelm and enslave our reason. Therefore, in order for reason to prevail in its struggle with the always potentially enslaving passions, reason stands in need of lies, a bodyguard of lies that from childhood on protect reason from the passions by calming the passions. In order to understand Socrates' contention in the Republic concerning the enslaving power of the passions and the relative weakness of reason, it is helpful to consider the opinions and the example of the character in whose son's home the dialogue takes place, Cephalus. The very old Cephalus virtually opens the conversation by affirming the enslaving power of the passions. But he then suggests that what liberates reason and virtue from such tyranny is not education, but old age. As the other pleasures connected to the body waste away, so do the desires and pleasures concerning speeches, concerning logoi, no rational speeches, increase. Then, mentioning freedom for the first time in the dialogue, Cephalus declares, "For in every way there comes to be much peace and freedom from such things in old age. Once the desires cease to strain and become slack, it is possible to be released from very many mad masters." When Socrates invokes Homer for the first time in the dialogue, citing the phrase spoken twice by Priam on the evils of old age, to suggest that the time of life when one approaches death may be hard, Cephalus emphatically denies the suggestion. And yet, under Socrates' questioning, Cephalus quickly acknowledges that, quote, "When someone is near to supposing that he will come to an end, fear and care enter him. For the tales told about the things in Hades, that the one who has done injustice here must pay a penalty there, which were laughed at until then, at that time twist his soul, lest they be true. Then he comes to be full of suspicion and terror, frequently waking up from sleep, just as children do. He is terrified and lives with evil expectation." In Cephalus' account, the fear of death, triggered not simply by old age, but by the awareness that one is to reach the end of one's life, dominates one's mind, awake and asleep, and hence dominates one's very soul completely. Cephalus does suggest, through his speeches and through his example, that the passions as a whole always tend to dominate reason. The young tend to be dominated by their sexual desire, and the old tend to be dominated by their fear of death. But in his account, the domination of the fear of death seems more complete, for it alone fills the soul, rules it day and night, and torments it. And it is true that Cephalus speaks in the third person when speaking of the old man who, mindful of past misdeeds, wakes up in a fright from sleep. But the facts that Cephalus speaks of having been dominated by his passions when young, by very many masters who are mad, that he speaks on his own authority when describing the old man troubled by his past misdeeds, as though he speaks from personal experience, but cites the authority of Pindar, the poet Pindar, in describing the one conscious in himself of nothing unjust, and that Cephalus devotes himself so assiduously and eagerly to making sacrifices to the gods, as he suggests the fearful, unjust man would, all indicate that Cephalus is himself the man he describes, who is frightened of death and the hereafter. Through the example of Cephalus, Plato illustrates the enslaving power of the fear of death, and also suggests that poets such as Homer, with their frightening tales of Hades, intensify the despotic hold that the fear of death may come to have on a man like Cephalus, who has evidently heard such tales from youth. But what about the example of Achilles, who is clearly courageous, clearly capable of risking death, and even at times of recognizing and seeming to accept the finality of death, while still believing that death is an evil? Is he not, as Socrates says, the courageous guardians must be free, that is, free from the tyranny of the passions? Socrates suggests in two ways that Achilles is not truly free from the sway of passion. First, by referring twice to Achilles' dream of the dead Patroclus, Socrates indicates that Achilles continues to be frightened of death, of what death might hold in store for his friend, but also for himself. And this fear haunts his dreams, as the fear of death evidently haunts the dreams of Cephalus. Secondly, Socrates seems to have Achilles in mind when he suggests that those who believe that death and Hades are evil will be overwhelmed by fear, and as a result of such fear, they will be, quote, hotter and softer than they ought. For Socrates suggests here not only that a powerful fear of death may lead humans to be soft in the sense of being cowardly, but that it may lead humans to be hot in the sense of giving themselves to passion, perhaps especially to the passion of anger, to overcome their fear of death. As Homer himself highlights in the first line of the Iliad, Achilles is possessed by wrath, and is especially moved by wrath when risking his life on the battlefield. Moreover, as Socrates later notes, Achilles continues to speak to Patroclus and of him as though he were alive, even though he is dead, and continues to punish Hector even though he is dead, and thereby indicates that Achilles does not truly face death and accept its finality, notwithstanding his battlefield courage. So Socrates suggests then that the principal defect of the Homeric education is that in the first place, insofar as it instructs humans to follow the example of Achilles, it does not truly liberate humans from the sway of the passions, but attempts to counteract the power of the fear of death with the power of anger and other passions. And in the second place, it does not overcome the enslaving power of that fear in an effective and lasting way. Socrates suggests that the wiser way to free humans from the enslaving power of the fear of death is to diffuse that fear from childhood by instilling the calming and reassuring, albeit false, opinion that death is not to be feared. For in this way, humans can fight to defend their freedom from conquest by others, but can also free their minds from the enslaving fear of death. By rearing humans to be calm and collected, by stilling their fear of death, Socrates hopes to free reason from the rule of passions and habituate humans to think calmly and clearly. In his view, reason is such a fragile flower that it requires untruth. The truth, especially about death, threatens reason. The freedom of the rational mind therefore requires the aid of lies, especially about death, to protect it from the enslaving passions that truth will inevitably stir up. A defender of Homer might argue that Homer himself exhibits a rational acceptance of the finality of death, one that is rendered far more impressive than that Socrates advocates by its rootedness in a clear-eyed account of human mortality and in a humane sympathy for the suffering it entails. For example, over the course of the Iliad, Homer offers remarkably detailed and vivid descriptions of 134 battlefield deaths. These accounts reveal Homer to be a keen observer of how death occurs, a careful student of the anatomy of death, and acutely interested in the causes, the experience, and the human significance of death. One overpowering, inescapable conclusion driven home by Homer's medically accurate accounts of death is that human life depends for its very existence on the physical integrity of certain vital parts of the body. As Homer highlights over and over again, once one's head is stabbed, lopped off, or broken, or one's belly, chest, liver, throat, or heart is pierced, one's existence comes to an end. Quote, he took the spirit out of him, and his soul and fury were there released. He drew out at once both his soul and his spear. He breathed away his spirit like an earthworm that lies stretched out on the ground. Out flowed the black blood, and it wet the earth. Through such accounts, for example, Homer sternly impresses upon his audience the finality of death. He reveals himself to be free of the belief in immortality cherished by all of his heroes, even at times the lion-hearted Achilles. In this way, Homer comes to sight as the true model of human excellence in the Iliad. Socrates, however, suggests that this crucial, culminating aspect of the Homeric education suffers from a paradoxical defect. It is insufficiently poetic. Homer's heroes, above all Achilles, are grand but flawed heroes, tragic heroes, and as such they point beyond themselves. But the figure they point to, these vivid heroes point to, the figure of the wise, humane singer, is not only hidden behind the muses, but remarkably abstract, not graspable by our imagination, and hence imperceptible, one might say, to our mind's eye. The figure of Homer in his poems lacks flesh and blood, lacks human details, lacks even a name. We know Homer only through his mind. We have to think our way through his characters, his judgments, his descriptions of death, and also his magnificent similes to apprehend Homer himself. But Socrates suggests that in this critical aspect of his education, Homer again overestimates the strength of reason. Homer does not recognize that reason requires the support of habituation, a habitual practice in the virtues and the freedom from passion that are necessary for living a life guided by reason. But such habitual practice must be inspired by the desire to imitate an exemplary human being who vividly displays in his own person such virtues and such freedom, who indeed embodies the life of reason. Plato's Socrates contends then that Homer does not recognize that poetry, a poetry that brings the philosopher to the fore as a hero to be imitated, is needed to strengthen and support philosophy. Homer does not recognize the need for an imitative philosophic poetry, such as Plato's. Now, it is true that Plato hides himself as Homer hides himself. But unlike Homer, Plato does not hide the way of life he admires, the philosophic life, his own way of life. Rather, for the first time in history, with unsurpassed vividness and charm, Plato openly presents a model of genuine human excellence, the philosopher Socrates. This is the revolution brought about by Plato, a revolution explained and justified by Plato's Socrates' critique of Homer in the Republic. Unlike Homer, and unlike also the tragic poets and Thucydides who follow Homer, Plato presents the philosopher in the full light of day as a model for imitation. Accordingly, Plato offers a dramatic portrait of the philosopher, especially in the three dialogues in which Plato himself appears or is mentioned, and in which his brothers, Glaucon and Adeimantus, appear prominently. In the Apology, where we see Socrates on trial for his life, in the Phaedo, on the day of his death and at the moment of his death, and in the Republic, in which Socrates presents an extensive, edifying, and as Glaucon says, a wholly noble depiction of the philosophic life. In all the dialogues, but in these three in particular, Plato offers the philosopher Socrates as a model for imitation for philosophic natures, and thereby completes the education of philosophic natures that Plato's Socrates sketches in his critique of Homer in the Republic. In all the dialogues, but in these three in particular, Plato founds the Platonic education, the Platonism intended to replace the Homeric education. The Platonic education focuses on the imitation of Socrates. How does such imitation reflect Socrates' critique of the Homeric education? As we have seen, Socrates' critique of Achilles focuses on his stance toward death, his passionate fear of his own death and of the deaths of his loved ones, a fear that can only be overcome by such passions as anger. In his Apology and Phaedo, Plato presents Socrates as apparently fearless in the face of death. In his defense speech before the Athenian jurors, Socrates denounces the fear of death as unreasonable and declares that what may well set him apart from most human beings is that he does not fear death. And Socrates seems to match these words with his deeds, for rather than beg in any way for his life, Socrates is remarkably defiant throughout his defense speech. By asserting that death is not an evil, and by backing his words with his emphatically fearless behavior toward the jury, Socrates evidently seeks to inspire his companions to master their own fear of death, as Socrates argues that poets should do in the Republic. Even more notably, in the Phaedo, his companion Phaedo bears witness to Socrates' remarkable serenity in the face of his actual death. The Phaedo also bears witness to Socrates' remarkable self-sufficiency, a self-sufficiency that Socrates in the Republic calls on the poets to celebrate and criticizes Homer's heroes and gods for lacking. Not only does Socrates refuse to lament his own death, but he apparently feels no sorrow at leaving behind his family and friends. As Phaedo explains to his philosophic audience, Socrates convinced his friends through his demeanor in the face of death and his arguments for the immortality of the soul that death is not evil, and thereby calmed their pity, sorrow, and especially their fear of death. The culmination of Socrates' efforts to free the mind by assuaging the fear of death is his promulgation in the Phaedo, and also at the end of the Republic, of the doctrine of the immortality of the soul. A doctrine which, along with the doctrine of the forms, was to constitute the doctrinal core of Platonism. Through his powerful poetic portrayal of Socrates' apparent fearlessness in the face of death in the Apology and Phaedo, and through his presentation of Socrates' arguments for immortality in the Phaedo and the Republic, Plato seeks to promote a Platonic education that strengthens the rule of reason over the potentially enslaving fear of death more effectively than does the old Homeric education. Now, to be sure, in the Apology, the Phaedo, and the Republic, Plato's Socrates indicates that there may be reasons for wondering whether death is not truly an evil, and hence whether it is truly unreasonable to fear death. Furthermore, as modern, contemporary, and even ancient commentators have noted, Socrates falls short of demonstrating the immortality of the soul in either the Phaedo or the Republic. Nevertheless, the powerful example that Plato presents on the surface of both the Apology and the Phaedo is that of a philosopher serene and fearless in the face of death. And the surface impression that Plato conveys in both the Republic and the Phaedo is that a follower of Socrates should embrace the doctrine of the immortality of the soul. Ultimately, those who strive to follow Socrates and Plato most attentively and faithfully must, in their maturity, critically examine both Socrates' arguments for immortality and his demeanor. Such an examination would ultimately free their minds from the prejudices of their Platonic education. But those followers will be better able to carry out such an examination in a dispassionate and self-possessed manner, thanks to their habitual imitation of the dispassionate and self-possessed Socrates, and thanks to their long-standing adherence to the calming and reassuring doctrine of immortality. Through all of his dialogues, but especially through the Apology, Phaedo, and Republic, Plato offers a new Platonic education as a replacement for the Homeric education that encourages admiration first for the tragic warrior hero, the virtuous, pious, passionate, sorrowing, and questioning Achilles, but ultimately for the enigmatic, humane, philosophic poet Homer himself. For that education, as Plato's Socrates explains in the Republic, gravely underestimates the weakness of reason and the potentially enslaving power of the passions, and consequently ends up romanticizing and strengthening at the expense of reason the passions of anger, honor, pity, sorrow, love, and especially the fear of death. Through his vivid presentation of Socrates, the fearless, dispassionate, self-sufficient philosopher who promulgates the reassuring doctrines of the immortality of the soul and the forms as an explicit object of admiration and model for imitation, Plato offers an education that seeks to calm the passions, to strengthen reason among philosophic natures, and to enhance the status of reason and philosophy in the world as a whole. In this way, even though Plato certainly does not expect all to become philosophers, he does, as Plutarch says, seek effectively to open a path to philosophy for all. Now, a defender of Homer might challenge Plato's poetic presentation of the philosopher as a fearless, self-sufficient promulgator of the doctrines of the separate forms and the immortality of the soul, on the grounds that such a presentation risks substituting a spirit of respectable dogmatism for a spirit of radical philosophic questioning. For while Plato indicates that such a poetic presentation is necessary to prepare philosophic natures to follow reason over their passions, but must itself eventually be subjected to the scrutiny of reason, a defender of Homer might contend that the philosophical prejudices self-consciously promoted by Plato to tame the passions may ultimately shackle and enslave reason as well. This challenge to the Platonic education regarding its predisposition to dogmatism was to be made most prominently by Nietzsche. In this way, the debate between Homer and Plato concerning the proper introduction to philosophy is one that has continued down to our own day. That's all I've got. Thank you. Say 40 minutes of outrageous statements. I clearly
isn't Nietzsche's criticism right? I mean, follow through the thought that you had there. Isn't it Platonism create a new dogmatism that really clouds from the mind our mortality?
I mean, I guess that, as I understand it, I mean, to the extent that the choice is this sort of, this Homeric sort of tragic education that kind of stirs up the passions, with all sorts of, painful problems and so forth. There is the danger that simply, glamorizes the passions and sort of ultimately, blocks one's reason. So I think, the Platonic strategy, at least as I suggest it, is to follow a different path, to follow this path of a kind of emphasizing a certain, calmness of character and mind that does risk this a kind of dogmatism, but that ultimately is less problematic than its alternative, I guess. Part of what I try to do in this is partly to make sense of what it means to say that Homer is the educator of the Greeks, but also to try to make sense of Platonism. Because I think even though I don't believe Plato was a Platonist, I also believe Plato founded Platonism. I mean, I think that perhaps is not always appreciated, perhaps, to some extent, that he founded it. And right, what problems there might be with that, but also what might be the sort of rationale behind that.
One way to get at the issue maybe is, why is it that Platonism then isn't presented in Book 3 of the Republic, which is what you focused on? There the emphasis is a sort of austere calmness, and not obviously we're going to present a teaching that will really teach you that death is not an evil. In fact, Socrates seems to imply that's what he's going to do, and then he doesn't do it. So yeah, I'm wondering how you think about the purpose of the education then in that part of the Republic as opposed to other parts. And yeah, Book 10 it comes in and it's much more clear there's an immortality of the soul. But
yeah, I guess one thing, and this may be questionable, but there is an interpretation of the Republic that sharply distinguishes the education in books 2 and 3 as simply for the self-philosophic warriors.
I was kind of wondering about that too, but yeah.
And book 10 as simply for the philosophic natures. And I guess I wonder if that isn't, that they aren't more closely related, that they don't sort of blend together or overlap in Plato's presentation. So yeah, I mean, I guess I therefore wonder whether the salutary lives of that are conveyed and the rationale for them in books 2 and 3 are not meant to shed light on what needs to also be told the philosophic natures. I mean, he does introduce them as philosophic natures even in book 2. But yeah, so that's sort of how I try to link it with the more Platonistic, especially the doctrine of immortality at the end, and then the Phaedo, which I somehow always end up going back to.
Go ahead.
You're deferring to me? Are you feeling all right? Yeah. You do. It's very reasonable. Yeah, so I was wondering about whether the fear of death is a passion opposed to reason, to what extent it is. At first glance, you might think that the fear of death is eminently reasonable, an eminently reasonable passion. I mean, in two ways on its face. That on the one hand, it's a passion that can't come into being without reason, and then on the other hand, those who lack the passion seem to lack reason. The people who are insufficiently afraid of death and behave accordingly seem to be quite mad to us and lack reason. So in both of these ways, it would seem that the passion is very much infused with reason, and vice versa. Now you kind of, I think, acknowledged this at one point and said there's the reasonable passion which transforms into the unreasonable passion of the fear of death. And I'm wondering, how does that transformation take place exactly? Because it seems like what you had in mind, I think you said at one point, is that the fear of death, it reaches a point at which you try to escape death, or you fail to accept its inevitability, and that's when it becomes unreasonable. But what goes into that transformation? It seems that there are two options. Either the fear of death reaches an extreme, it's a quantitative change, and it increases to such a point where someone starts to think death is actually avoidable. Or does the fear of death need some kind of additional element added to make that jump, the leap to the opinion that death is avoidable? Because if it's the latter, then it's not the case that the fear of death, the reasonable passion of the fear of death, transforms of itself into the unreasonable passion.
I mean, I guess one way perhaps of putting the question, I don't want to put words in your mouth, is to the extent the fear of death becomes, rejects the limits, the inevitability of death, and therefore, for example, maybe this isn't the only way it could become, perhaps unreasonable, but is then, becomes open to sort of hopes, religious hopes and fears.
Yeah.
I guess, I think both Plato and Homer think that's to some extent inevitable, And so then the question is, to what extent one can, I mean, I think in Homer, one is meant to somehow face that and wrestle with it, whereas I think there's an attempt in Plato to, try to diffuse that, almost, so that for example, I mean, in Homer, your nose is rubbed into this thought that they're gods and they don't care about us, and that therefore the grounds for this hope are really dubious and so forth. Whereas in the Republic, for example, what Socrates seems to sketch out is that the gods are benign, the gods are sort of powerless or relatively powerless. So that there's an attempt to sort of appeal to, in a kind of respectful way, to a kind of piety, but a piety that is, so to speak, more reasonable because it's less upsetting. It's also, it's more in conformity. It may point sort of to a kind of necessity, but not too harshly. So I think that there's sort of two different strategies, I guess. But I think both of them acknowledge that, seem to acknowledge that there is, just a kind of natural tendency among human beings. I mean, there is reason, maybe also, I agree completely. I mean, the fear of death seems to be peculiar to rational beings, but also maybe, reason is somehow gives rise to a kind of imagination also, that can, that seems, almost inevitably to lead to these other, I mean, religion being one manifestation, but maybe not the only one, of a kind of resistance of this extremely harsh reality. Yeah.
Just first an observation. It seems to me in order for your argument to be persuasive, you really do need to say more than you do in this obviously truncated talk.
Right.
About the problem that was raised concerning the relationship between the education, the first education and the second education.
Right.
And it seems to me you also need to take into account, make a persuasive case for the view that what Socrates says in Book 3 is in part dependent on who he's talking to and what he is trying to do with respect to them. Now again, I don't mean to say you couldn't defend yourself, but it seems to me the argument is incomplete if you don't make it. Now it also seems to me that you in a way concede that you need to do this, because as I understand it, your argument about the Platonic education as you present it is only the first stage of philosophical education. It has to be succeeded by something else, and that something else seems to me to be an education which radically calls into question the surface, which is so. Now the question I have, however, is this: it seems to me that I'm not sure whether this would be a Homeric response to Plato, but it does seem to be a perfectly reasonable response to Plato, and that is, doesn't Plato himself overestimate the power of reason with respect to the passions? In other words, doesn't Plato, in undertaking the task that you claim he undertakes, which is to dethrone Homer as the teacher of the Greeks, and ultimately as the teacher of humankind, it seems to me, isn't he asking, expecting from philosophy much more than it can deliver, or from science much more than it can deliver? I mean, what's the difference between what Plato is undertaking and what the Enlightenment undertook? Now, the Enlightenment might be a somewhat grander project. It also, there seems to be no embrace by Plato of the technological dimension of the Enlightenment, which after all may be the most important element of the Enlightenment in terms of the most important weapon or power of the Enlightenment. But it does seem to me, at least, one has to take into account this question of, isn't your Plato, let's say Lawrence Lambert's Plato, isn't your Plato, if not the Enlightenment forerunner, someone pretty close to the Enlightenment forerunner? Now, I'm not suggesting, therefore, you're wrong, but I'm saying you simply don't address that issue. I mean, the idea that philosophy or science can simply transform the human situation, which it seems to me, if Plato is successful, he is done. And you think it's good that he's not. Which is what? Which
Did I
is.
say that?
Well, I mean, just one last point. The other thing that seems to me that needs some attention, and this is connected to the whole question of enlightenment, is you seem to take for granted that what's good for potential philosophers is good for everybody else. And again, that seems to me not at all obvious. And it's not at all obvious that Plato thought that. So.
Yeah, you know, there's much that you say that I have to think about, and you know, but just two things. You know, with regard to, I mean, first of all, you know, yeah, I do think it is important to recognize the amazing ambition of Plato. You know, I mean, there is just an amazing boldness. I mean, I think, you know, when one precisely if you think of him in comparison to the Enlightenment, you know, Plato, you know, seems more sober and moderate and so forth. And but I mean, you know, there are 35 dialogues, 33 celebrate one man, one way of life. You know, and then and along with this, he founded a school that lasted for 900 years. No, I mean, so that there was this a kind of project, but it's not like the Enlightenment. I mean, in a way, I mean, precisely because it's Platonistic. I mean, the whole idea seems to be I mean, and this is the complexity is that, I mean, the way one might put it is that Plato presents on stage, you know, a figure who had been kept in the shadows, you know, the philosopher. But the philosopher whom he reveals on stage is a respectable, moral, pious, and edifying figure, rather than the radical skeptic he was suspected of being. You know? I mean, that's the whole idea of the, you know, the doctrine of immortality, the presentation of Socrates, the fearless, and so forth. Now, yeah, I mean, you said, and I think this is true, that is an ultimate. I mean, that is a rhetorical strategy of Plato's. That is a kind of preparatory to the ultimate, you know, philosophic education. But I think it seems to me it's very significant in Plato that ultimate philosophic education is muted. I mean, it's hidden. I mean, the surface is much more conventional. No, I mean conventional in this, you know, I mean, conventional in the sense of being kind of friendly to morality and to piety. So I think that's. I mean, I think that is what. You know, it's not like the Enlightenment in that respect. I mean, it's much more, it's not secular or something like that. I mean, the whole idea, it seems to be, but the question in a way is that is the danger that the radical skepticism of philosophy is so hidden in Plato that it becomes forgotten. And I think that is, I wonder whether, I mean, again, this goes, you know, feel like I'm just making these assertions, but I think that is the question that Nietzsche raises about, or for example, and I think even Strauss raises that question about.
No, I think that's right. But I didn't mean to suggest that the two kinds of enlightenment, Platonic and modern, were identical. I just meant to suggest that doesn't Plato presuppose that reason has enough power, when wielded properly, to literally transform the world. And in that sense, that's what I meant by.
Yeah, or another way of putting it is that it's possible for a poetic, you know, a philosophic, poetic figure to create a culture, we might say, that is much more friendly and supportive to philosophy than what had preceded it, even though what had preceded it was philosophic in its intention and to some extent in its results. I mean, Plato and Socrates are also results of the Homeric education.
And that raises the questions we were talking about before about whether or not such a transformation, which may be good for philosophy, is good for the rest of humankind.
Yeah, I mean, and it may not be good for philosophy. I mean, it may. I mean, I think in a way that's the question.
Isn't there also another alternative? I wonder whether you think there is another alternative. It seems to me that the Homer-Plato alternative, with Nietzsche and perhaps others in the background coming to the defense of Homer, seems to not exhaust the possibilities. And I'm thinking of Xenophon, whose strategy seems to be quite different, even though he may agree in important ways with Plato. His strategy is very different. And in some ways, if he had succeeded to the extent that Plato succeeded, the results may have been very different. So I wonder if you could just say something about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think Xenophon, in a way, strategy, I would say, is in some ways arguably more philosophic, more friendly to philosophy than Plato, because, I mean, that Plato's strategy, I mean, this is the strategy / danger, is to turn philosophy into a kind of religion. You know, that philosophy is unquestionably the best way of life, and therefore, you know, that it becomes almost a kind of article of faith. And whereas Xenophon, you know, he does not tempt one in that direction. He presents multiple, at least, you know, 2 or 3 models of human excellence that one has to think about. You know, and one has to think about for oneself. So I think in that respect, I wonder, you know, I think one may almost wonder whether Xenophon isn't, you know, a kind of expressing through his writings a kind of note of caution about Plato, or even a kind of note of criticism.
It's not just that he presents multiple models, while at the same time leading you to see the defects in all of them, in comparison with Socrates, but also perhaps Socrates does. But he also doesn't present Socrates as a model in the same way that Plato presents Socrates as a model. And that seems to me to be, I mean, he hides the philosophical life much more than Plato does.
I mean, by multiple models, I mean there's Cyrus, but there's also Xenophon.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah.
and Xenophon, I think that's I mean, this is different, I think, from Socrates. He may be a philosopher too, but he's different. He's not just that one model. I mean, we could talk about you know, with regard to the book 2 versus book 10, it does seem to me, I think that you know, there is this difficulty that, and you know, many people make this argument, and I certainly have made this argument, that his discussion of book 2 and 3 have nothing to do with philosophic nature. That's not what he introduces it with, by introducing, you know, philosophy, and it does come up, you know, and similarly later on, the discussion of the philosophic nature bears certain resemblances to, you know, the gods, the ideas, you know, the immortality of the soul, the problem of death, and so forth. But anyway, I mean, that's a long story, and you're certainly right that what I say here is not sufficient. Yes?
This may be a minor point, but sort of early in your talk, you referred to this was in the course of your discussion of the education in books 2 and 3 as, in some respect, being an education for philosophers, and you suggested, if I understood you right, that philosophers too live perennially, under the sway of the passions, or potentially under the sway of the passions, that the passions could resurface at any particular moment and overwhelm their reason. And so you could have some such notion as a sort of backsliding philosopher, right, who masters the lower passions, ascends out of the cave, but then at some moment, as a result of some experience, loses his philosophical clarity of vision. It's such an interesting and arresting idea, and I wonder if is there textual evidence that you would point to support that the notion that there is such a thing, and that Socrates is intends us to read the education as somehow safeguarding against this, or is it just a surmise that you're led to on the basis of the apparent logic of the teaching that the philosophers would be selected from those educated according to the education of the argument?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. I mean, the focus is on the young, so he doesn't really say that these young are philosophers, but they have philosophic natures, so they're spirited and philosophic and swift and strong. And so I think, the emphasis seems to be that they can, develop in a variety of ways depending on the kinds of things they believe in. And so, but one thing he does stress is that what should guide their education is not primarily even what is true, but what is beneficial to them, and with regard to the passions in particular. So because he says at one point, he says about the gods, he says even if it were true that they quarrel or that they do these crazy things, they shouldn't be told that. So there is this sort of emphasis on what is what is beneficial, how to sort of address this problem of the passions. Now there is that in Book 10, Socrates says, when he talks about Homer, he says, I think I quoted a little bit of this when he says that the experience of weeping, I think he says it, I think it's to Glaucon, he says, doesn't it, don't you enjoy it? Don't we enjoy it, this weeping? And doesn't it make, stir up in us what should be ruled and make it rule? So in a way, he does suggest, again, maybe playfully, but it's not merely among children. No, I mean, that just the experience of, admiring Achilles, or maybe his tragedy, he links this very much to the experience of seeing tragedy, does pose a certain danger in a way, or can. I don't know if that would ultimately be to someone like Socrates, but still that it would be a danger.
And then can I follow up with two small sort of textual matters? So, as I recall the discussion with respect to the afterlife at the beginning of Book 3, he initially says, shouldn't they be told things that they'll make them something like fear death least, but then it's quickly revised to be to fear death less than defeat and slavery. And then the same in the Apology, it's not total fearlessness. Like you use the formulation with respect to Socrates, fearlessness, over and over again. And I think if I remember, I mean, even in the Apology, he doesn't claim fearlessness, only no conviction about it being, an evil or a bad of a particular kind. Right. And then the last little thing that obviously occurs is yes, Socrates behaves very impressively in the Phaedo, but then what about the cover?
Yeah. Although that is one place where adeos is used. I mean, Phaedo says he seemed fearless, or he appeared fearless, and that in the Republic he goes a little back and forth between those. I think in Book 3 maybe is where he says that a decent person shouldn't fear death at all, and then in Book 10 should fear at least.
There's a difference between fearing at least. And
I believe so. Yes, no, definitely. Zach, did you have your hand up earlier?
You took my question. I was going to ask about Xenophon and the alternative he represented. So.
Yeah, I mean, one thing, Dick, if I may say, my intention was not to present Plato as, my focus, I guess, in the talk is on Plato, but I tried also to, how a defender of Homer might respond to that. So I didn't mean at all to, suggest, or certainly to presuppose that that Plato, was. That I thought he was more persuasive. I mean, I've actually been accused more of the opposite in giving such talks. My work on Homer being too pro Homer. That's why I was somewhat surprised.
I've always thought you weren't pro Homer enough.
Knowledge more.
I mean, it is. I guess this is a small thing, but I don't understand why you're not more skeptical about the use of the term philosophy and its derivatives in books 2 and 3. I mean, after all, yes, he does talk about them as being philosophers, but he is talking to someone like Glaucon. And he also likens them to dogs. And the analogy to dogs is, in a way, not a good one. So I'm not saying that one doesn't have to take seriously the question of the relationship between an education meant for for the best of the non-philosophers, and an education meant for philosophers. But it seems to me you just sort of glide over the difficulties, and I guess I don't understand why.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I wonder whether in the dialogues he doesn't always present Socrates speaking to people like Glaucon. I mean, that's so that
yes,
I mean, there are difficulties, but that I guess before understanding the difficulties, I guess what I'm trying to do is to try to think about what is the rationale for this surface presentation.
Yeah, no, I understand that, and I think that the case you make is a strong one, but I think it does tend to presuppose certain things that I would say need a more explicit defense. And the other thing is I come back to this, is that as you yourself say, there is such a dramatic difference between let's say the first phase of the philosophic education as you presented, and the philosophic education, that the philosophic education, it seems to me, virtually uproots everything in the first phase. That's a pretty dramatic transformation, so that it's not. I once had an argument with Tom Tangle about this. It's not as if there is simply an unbroken ascent, from common opinion to the first phase to philosophy. There is a break there, and that break is perhaps as dramatic as any break you can imagine. That seems to me to be something you need to take into account. I mean, now maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the break isn't that dramatic. I think it is. So
yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I understand the disagreement. I mean, I guess what I wonder is whether, that somehow Plato points to that, but he doesn't really present it. No, and that again, what is distinctive about Plato is to present Socrates, to present the philosopher, as this, hero, but also as this sort of, respectable hero. I mean, a kind of that he doesn't present him the way, as the philosopher, who threatens everything and everyone believes in and therefore should be killed. Right? I mean, that's in a way what he seems to dedicate his poetry to, is to present this figure who had been, presented at most, in a comedy as being, this.
But he does. I mean,
extremely compelling, character.
Yes,
but in a way also kind of conventional. He's courageous, he's fearless, et cetera, et cetera.
But he always, I mean, look, it's true, but you'd have to be blind to not see that those encounters in the dialogues are not unanimous in their view that he's respectable.
Sure.
And the people who suspect that he isn't respectable are, in their own ways, serious people. Now, of course, they are presented in they are not presented as the most serious people. But it's not as if there is, in other words, Plato presents Socrates in a way that is more complicated or nuanced than the image of Socrates as an exemplary figure.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely, unquestionably. But that's not. But I guess I think this is the question: is to what extent that, I mean, is not on not the very powerful surface of Plato, So that again, I mean, Plato is not a Platonist, but he founds Platonism, and that's sort of the paradox, I think, that I guess I'm trying to make sense of.
We have one more.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. So this might have bear some relation to some of what I'm talking about with Dick. I'm not sure what he said, but it seems to me you could draw a distinction between two audiences or two intended effects of the Platonistic education. I think we've been focusing more on the philosophic audience or the potentially philosophic audience and the intended effect with them, and we've been emphasizing that there's this necessity of ultimately of moving beyond that. But what about an audience that Plato doesn't think is potentially philosophic, but will be influenced by this and will come to have a certain view of philosophers or philosophy? And the point is for that audience to keep them there, you want them to be Platonists and stay Platonists, and maybe there's no possibility of them ascending beyond it, but there might be the possibility of them, being Homeric or Nietzschean or just, take your pick. And so I don't know if you have thoughts about that distinction.
And it's an interesting question to what extent, the Platonist, where that really fits, because it doesn't seem, obviously it's not as though, you would have a whole society of, Kebeses and Simiuses and, but on the other hand, that there could be, a kind of significant elite, I guess you could say. To some extent, just as the Homer is the education of the elite that sets a certain tone for a certain culture or society, that the education Plato proposes would, again, set a certain tone. And I guess, I think, just as in Homer, that a few of those people will go beyond the sort of tragic culture of the Greeks, something like that, that in Plato, a few of those people will go beyond, the Platonistic culture that he is establishing, and each point to the need for that. But I guess just as Plato suggests that Homer, risks not clearly pointing beyond, I think that question also can be raised about Plato, and about Platonism. To what extent these sort of subtle indications, might get buried. I mean, to put it one way, I don't know if this is too off topic, but I think of this to some extent in terms of Strauss. Strauss identifies himself very much with Plato, now a Platonic political and so forth. But on the other hand, the Platonic dialogues he writes on, and especially are not the Platonistic dialogues. No, I mean the Euthydemus, the Minos, the Laws, and even the Republic. What he writes on in the Republic is notoriously not on the Platonistic portions of the Republic. So, to what extent is, I wonder, is that a kind of, on the one hand, an attempt to rescue Plato, so to speak, from Platonism, by highlighting all the ways, all the subtle ways in which, there's so much more there than that, but to what extent that also may be a kind of question about Plato's rhetoric, that not as loud as Nietzsche, and so, but still, I mean, and maybe also the interest in Xenophon, the focus on Xenophon and Aristophanes, may also, he chose to write on, Xenophon and all of Aristophanes' plays rather than on the Timaeus, the Phaedo. Is that, might there not be some question about this approach?
Doesn't he explicitly say somewhere? I wonder if Plato is too successful.
Yeah.
I don't know if he's talking about Machiavelli or Xenophon.
No, but he does mention Plato. Yeah, I think it's in the restatement.
I think he.
And also, when he talks about the distinction between philosophy in the medieval, in the introduction to persecution of the art of writing, where he says that in the Christian world, philosophy was tolerated, but the price of that toleration was a kind of ecclesiastical supervision, whereas in the Jewish and Muslim world, it was not tolerated, but it had this inner freedom. Might that also not be a kind of
he's very,
on Platonism?
In the, I think it's in the unpublished Ops book, he says explicitly, he agrees explicitly the bad effects of Platonism and the need, and therefore raises the question of whether there is a different philosophy that is not, let's say, as dangerous in that way. And I think he really did have his taste for Xenophon. I think Xenophon is close to what Strauss thought was the right strategy as anyone knew.
But again, on the surface, Strauss, Platonic studies in Platonic political philosophy, and natural right history, Plato, so so it's an interesting,
and that leads back to this. I think I think it's a very serious question, and that is the philosophy, as you suggest, is reminding us that Plato Socrates traces the philosophical tradition to Homer, and which is, again, that's, think of how radical that is. And at the same time, identifies the philosophical tradition with a tradition of esotericism. Now, from the beginning, so philosophy from the beginning, whether one thinks about the beginning in terms of Homer, Hesiod, the tragedians, Aristophanes, or whether one thinks the beginning, let's say, Parmenides, Heraclitus, or whoever preceded them, is always concerned about two audiences, is always at least two audiences, is always concerned about the question of a rhetorical strategy which takes into account the cleavage between what's good for the philosophers and what's good for, let's say, the city. So that the question of whether the rhetorical strategy embraced by either this person or that person, but let's say in this case especially Plato, is in fact the best rhetorical strategy from both points of view. So you have to look at both whether it was the most effective strategy with respect to potential philosophers, but also whether, let's say, the image of Socrates, as you rightly say, is on the surface of the dialogue. So is that really the best life from the point of view of an ordinary citizen and what's good for an ordinary citizen? It seems to me completely questionable that it is.
Sure.
So, yeah.
I mean, I think you could say that about Achilles too. I
Sure.
mean, in a way, I wonder whether both Homer and Plato don't really focus more on the question of what's good for, the life of the mind rather than.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming.